Okay, Lydia, at the end of the last part, you did mention the pattern. I mean, you still work for the British Flat Pattern Committee.
And the chair, yeah.
Can you give us a little bit of, just tell us about it, really?
Okay, so our job is to ensure that the British pattern is functioning as well as it possibly can, so that it is providing races of the right kind of tests, whether that be relevant to distance or age, or for horses to develop to be their athletic best. And we have to operate within the European Pattern Committee, so there are agreements with the rest of Europe involving, which are sensible agreements and really help Britain actually, because it ensures that similar races do not clash with each other, which means that without a pattern, without those international agreements, you could have a really important race in Britain, which another country could just park their very good race on top of, and potentially and likely in the current environment be worth more money. And it's better for Europe as a collective entity to work together, particularly with the international pressures that I've already described around the world, because it can enable us to be have the best collective product that we can. But the key point is to be able to find a way to develop horses to be the best that they can, or to be able to express what ability they do have if they can't get to the top level at the Group 2 or Group 3 or listed, so that we are able to learn and test the horses and bring about the best horses to go then into breeding. It's for the betterment of the sport, it's for the betterment of the breed. And one of the key things that we say is that the members of the Pattern Committee are chosen for their love of the sport and for their understanding of the complicated issues at play, the interplays, and it means that they have to leave whatever partisan attachments that they might have at the door. So they might be a trainer, they might represent a race course, they might be a breeder, whatever. Those subjective interests have to be left at the door, because this is for the betterment of British racing, for the greater good of British racing, and people can't approach it in a subjective way. That means that, obviously, inevitably, if you have expertise in this industry, you end up having ties. That's just inevitable. So then that's just a case of managing those conflicts in terms of declaring them, stepping out, not voting, or declaring them during the course of a conversation, depending on what level of conflict might exist. So that relies on the probity of the committee, the probity of the chair, and also of Ruth Quinn, who's the BHA's Director of International Racing. So she and I together lead the committee. We meet 3 or 4 times a year. I go to the European Pattern Committee with Ruth twice a year. And it's really interesting. I find it really interesting. And I think, again, we're into a sort of challenging situation, I think, whereby Britain at the moment doesn't have enough money, seems to have an undersupply of horses at certain levels, and that might require us having a look at the pattern and seeing whether it still, in its current form, exact pattern, fits our horse population properly, or whether it needs some strategic looking at. That's work that we will be doing in consultation with stakeholders.
Okay, and this is one part of race planning that's purely about the furtherment of the breed rather than betting, which is unusual.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not interested in. It wants competitive racing, so therefore, the betting public are not disadvantaged by anything the pattern is doing. They're advantaged by it. The whole point is to get clashes of athletes, competitive horse racing happening. So whilst betting is not on our minds and shouldn't be on our minds, and nothing other than that is on our minds, it is purely the development of the horse that is on our minds, and that's how the pattern should be. It should be operating, I believe, separately from all the political considerations that are quite rightly elsewhere in the sport, because this has to be something slightly apart.
Now, what you've just talked about is the more complex side of the sport that people probably, find it hard to fathom still. But a lot of people think that you should really dumb down the racing so that people that aren't interested, and possibly never will be interested, might be attracted. But these people probably won't get involved anyway. Do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea, or should the mystique of it being a bit complicated be the selling point?
I think you have to adapt the way you speak to your audience. So it is right that a terrestrial audience, in this era ITV, previously Channel 4 and BBC, it is right, I think, that the people who work in that area adjust their language so that a general sports audience can understand it. In racing, we've got a lot of terms that are not just... they're just hard to understand sometimes. And I think that it's helpful to be able to gloss it for a general sports viewer. That's without losing the mystique or without dumbing down. It's possible to communicate complicated concepts, complicated matters, and horse racing should, I think, glory in its complicatedness, because that's half of the draw, I think, or most of the draw even for many people. Many people who are into horse racing have never got on a horse, would certainly not get on a horse at speed or over obstacles. Part of the fun for them is working out who's going to win a race, and that requires taking on board a huge level of complexity of all the different elements that might impact on the outcome of a race. And that's what I find really interesting. It's like I've said this before, but it's like a cryptic crossword puzzle, and each race is a separate cryptic crossword puzzle, and there are loads of them every day, which is fantastic. I like them to be quite difficult, so hence I would like bigger field sizes and more competitiveness, but that's another issue. So I do think there's complexity in horse racing. I do think we should be proud of that. It's part of the sell. It's why people get interested. It's why people get hooked for life on horse racing, I think. I do think that it is possible to communicate that complexity in a way that is more easily understood. Increasingly, people would say that data would help, and that I absolutely agree with that. But I also think language does help too.
Okay, and if you were solely responsible for the coverage of the sport, what would it look like?
I think I'd give more time to the big events. I wouldn't want any race clashes. I just would want them completely eradicated from our timetable. They don't help the levy. They don't help the punter. They don't help anyone. So I would make sure that race clashes just did not happen, and that would probably involve a reduction in the fixture list to some degree. And I acknowledge that there would probably be some short-term pain to that, but I think it would be to the long-term benefit of British racing. But that would have to be done strategically and not just in a sort of piecemeal way. So yeah, I would give more time, eradicate race clashes. I would definitely give more time before and after our biggest races. I'd make sure that there is a differentiation between our best races and our other races, so that people at home understand when a race is important and why it's important. And I think that needs space and time around it for it to be absorbed. I do think there's still a need for, as I said, a sports fan's way of communicating and a racing fan's way of communicating. Some aspects of a terrestrial coverage will be too slow sometimes for a really dyed-in-the-wool racing fan. Fair enough. There are other avenues that you can watch. You can watch Sky Sports Racing. You can watch racing TV. There are other ways in which you can consume that sport, and I think that's right. So I still think that I would have that, and I would have the facility to be able to watch an afternoon's racing and not have to channel hop all the time and worry whether you're switching backwards and forwards. I mean, I'm a racing fan. I watch racing from home. It's just not satisfactory, is it? You end up recording the whole of one channel and then watching it back later.
Now, you've written about animal welfare, and racing is very conscious of the animal welfare situation. I mean, most people are horse lovers. But do you think there's a section of society that will keep on protesting in a drip manner until there's no racing? So there comes a point we've got to say, look, there's going to be risks. We've gone far enough.
I think there's a lot in that question. So I think that there is a section of society who believes that animals should not be utilised in any way for human benefit. So whether that be eating them wearing their skin, racing them, anything like that, farming them, whatever. There are some people who think that humans shouldn't have pets. So, yes, there are always going to be those people in society. What horse racing needs to be, when horse racing needs to be positioned, is where general society is and where their morality is, and that is an evolving, moving thing. You know, if we think about all sorts of issues like sexuality, there are so many different things where society has moved a great deal over the decades, and horse racing can't be immune to that. I know it's tempting to say, well, this is what we are and the rest of you can stuff off, but there is a social contract between the sport and society, British society, and without that, without the acceptance and the understanding of wider society, well, then the sport will dwindle and it won't function and it won't be able to carry on in a bubble. That just won't be able to happen. I also think it's wrong to suggest that the sport should say we've gone far enough in terms of welfare improvements, because I think it's evident that there are always improvements to be made. If you think about the Grand National, some of the modifications that have been made, now some of them with the most recent renewal where there were 2 fatalities have been called into question. I think it's right that it should be reviewed, but you know, there has been progress being made in lots of different ways. I mean, the white, painting the fences and the hurdles white, so that, you know, doing a scientific study to be able to see, find out that horses can actually see that colour better than the existing orange. There are lots of things that can be done. There's going to be no massive step change in horse racing that will eradicate. I mean, it's impossible to eradicate fatalities in racing, in any kind of activity that involves a live animal, I think. There's going to be no huge step change in reducing it, but there are little improvements, I think, that can be made all the time, and I think horse racing should do that. I think that's the socially responsible thing to do, and I think it shows that it is a sport that is considering that element and doing its best and investing and looking towards that. But, you know, that obviously will be a small element who are just opposed to horse racing, and you're never going to win them round. Horse racing is talking to the people in the middle who are receptive to reasoned and evidenced arguments. The key to that, obviously, is being honest and truthful. So that has to be. I mean, horse racing, I get frustrated when horse racing feels that it's best not to mention that, or best not to look at that, or, you know, because, you know, the implication being it's not very good over there. Well, if it's not very good over there, do something about it, because you can't pretend it's not there. So there are loads and loads of issues that I think need to be addressed, including overproduction at the start of a horse's career. You know, how many horses are being encouraged to be bred, particularly at the bottom end. You know, when they might not make race horses, and then what happens to them once they finish their racing career, and what is the right thing to do. Those are 2 huge areas that really do need addressing still. Massive improvements have certainly been made at the retraining, rehabilitation end. There's no doubt about that. The sport has improved traceability from birth and afterwards, but there are still massive improvements that need to be made in all of those key areas.